right, let's start with the big story that we are tracking this hour, where French President Emmanuel Macron is presently in India for a 4-day state visit. The French President has met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi just a little while back to hold delegation-level talks. The two leaders are holding delegation-level talks at Delhi's Hyderabad House. Now, the key issues which will be discussed are going to be energy, trade, maritime security and cross-border terrorism, besides defence cooperation, which are being discussed between Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Macron's visit is aimed at strengthening the bilateral economic, political and also the strategic dimension between the two nations. The Prime Minister Modi and President Macron will also be co-chairing the founding conference of the International Solar Alliance, which will take place on the 11th of March. Now, earlier, Macron had met with External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj in New Delhi. The two leaders discussed a variety of issues and looked forward to boosting ties between the two nations. Now, a ceremonial reception was also given to Macron earlier in the morning at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Ramnath Kovind welcomed the French President as India laid out the red carpet for him in New Delhi. Now, speaking after the ceremony, French President Emmanuel Macron said that France and India share a historic relationship that goes back in time.
For me, I have three purposes in this trip. The first one is to open a new era for this partnership and open for the coming decade a very strategic partnership in terms of defense and security, especially in the overall region, in terms of economy, research and science, and in terms of exchange between our youth, higher education and so on. It's absolutely critical because our two democracies have common challenges regarding terrorism, a lot of common risks, a lot of threats. But we have to protect this history and this taste for freedom. The second purpose of this trip is in order to organize this International Solar Alliance, and I think your Prime Minister will host a dinner this evening and tomorrow the conference, and this is a very important event, and I want really to thank your President and your Prime Minister for this leadership, and France will co-preside this conference, and that's the best way for both of us to deliver concrete commitments following Paris Agreement and our common decisions to be totally committed.
Also, French President Emmanuel Macron visited Rajghat in New Delhi and paid his respects to Mahatma Gandhi. Now, remember, he arrived in New Delhi last night and was received by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as a special gesture, who was present at the airport, breaking protocol. Now, their interaction at the airport was high on optics, with at least about 2 hugs and several handshakes which were exchanged. Now, Emmanuel Macron had last visited India in January in 2016 when he was the chief guest at the Republic Day celebrations. All right, now to discuss more on the significance of the visit of the French President, we are joined in our studio by former diplomat and also former spokesperson for the Prime Minister's Office and India's External Affairs Ministry, G. Parthasarathy. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us. And we're also going to be joined by my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran, who also joins us from the newsroom. But sir, let me begin with you. This of course is an important visit. India is trying to expand ties with France. Now, we discuss in terms of how India is trying to expand its global footprint, and France, especially in the defense sector, plays an important role for India.
Well, let's put it this way. People seem to forget that France has 3 bases in the Indian Ocean.
Right.
Djibouti, Reunion, and in Abu Dhabi. And we have in the Western Indian Ocean some 7 million Indians living.
Absolutely.
70% of our oil comes. So security of the Western Indian Ocean, I think this is going to be an important subject to discuss. Because it's becoming a more volatile region. Qatar, Yemen, and so on and so forth. And Djibouti, where both the French and the Chinese have a base, each, becomes very strategic. That is contemporary. But more importantly, this relationship is really old. The French have backed us on almost every occasion, including in the 1971 conflict.
Absolutely.
The earliest foreign fighter planes, apart from the Soviet Union, that we got were the Mystère in the 50s and the Mirage 2000, when we had to match the Pakistani F-16. They have been very reliable on spares.
Right.
And then more important strategic areas. Energy. People seem to forget that Bombay High, which gives us our largest domestic oil supplies, was initially brought in with French collaboration with Total.
Absolutely.
Space. Our geospatial satellites are launched by the French. Nuclear energy is expanding. Most important, what is forgotten, we faced after the 1974 blast about 30 years of nuclear sanctions. The persons who first wanted it and to cooperate was France. So it's been a natural partnership, very low-key. Now people seem to forget that there are over 1,000 French companies in India employing 3.5 lakhs of people. So this is a relationship, quiet, and which has to be taken forward. Because in the emerging world order, where the US is pitted against China and President Trump is going in rather unique directions, the French provide a stabilizing force when Britain has left the European Union.
Absolutely. We'll be discussing all of that in greater detail, Parthasarathy. Do continue to stay on with us. Let me bring in also my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran. Ramesh, this is an important and a significant visit, considering the stature which Macron presently enjoys in Europe. Britain is having its own problems with Brexit that it needs to resolve. Now, Angela Merkel is not the leader that she was, considering the kind of trouble that she's having in forging a coalition. With that being the case, it appears that Macron is the tallest leader in Europe and he is in India.
Absolutely, Mohammed. And just to take off from the point where Ambassador Parthasarathy left, Macron came to power on the 14th of May last year. And by the 3rd of June, Prime Minister Modi already became one of the few world leaders to call on President Macron in Paris. And that, to my mind, is significant because that meeting happened barely 48 hours after President Trump of the US withdrew Washington or pulled out Washington from the Paris Climate Accord. And that was a very disappointing moment, so to speak, for Paris and France in general. And Prime Minister Modi went out of his way to reassure his host, President Macron, that India will remain committed to the climate change accord, but also go beyond its commitments to ensure that climate change becomes a top priority for both France and India going forward. So that, to my mind, set the stage or the framework for the two leaders to have a working arrangement since then. And this visit, as Ambassador Parthasarathy mentioned, would be a key significant milestone for India-France relations, given it's happening on the 20th anniversary of the strategic partnership signed way back in 1998. And by the way, as Ambassador Parthasarathy mentioned, France was one of those few countries, or perhaps the only country, to oppose Western sanctions on India after the 1990 nuclear test by India. So France, probably after Russia, is the only country with which India has a comprehensive partnership that straddles all spheres of human activity, be it defense, security, counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, people-to-people ties, education, trade, investments, you name it. And France has been a reliable partner for India, and that, to my mind, gives both countries an edge, so to speak, or the foundation to build for the new era, as President Macron said this morning, for the next decade and more.
Absolutely. That was put so wonderfully well. Thank you very much indeed, Ramesh. Do stay on with us, though. But Ambassador Parthasarathy, you know, we talk a lot about India's relationship with Russia when it came to defense, and also the increasing closer ties with Israel, because we're importing a lot of military hardware. But we don't talk enough in terms of how much France has actually contributed in terms of India expanding its own weapons.
Let me tell you something. I was in the army and fought the 1965 conflict. We had a huge problem in Cham.
Right.
And there were a small group of French tanks called the AMX, which confronted American patterns and got the better of them. So French equipment, as I said, goes back to past conflicts.
Absolutely.
And right now, 6 Scorpion submarines, all being built in Indian shipyards. And these are really amongst the conventional submarines about the best you can find in the world. So yes, in today's world, I think it is not good to be dependent on any one
Absolutely.
power.
That's
So you've got the Russians, you've got the Americans, and you've got the French. And certainly in economic terms, Germany. Sadly, Britain is sort of its profile is being reduced after it left the
that's a point that I wanted to ask you about. Considering what's happening in Britain, they have their own problems with Brexit. Now, Angela Merkel, the future is a little uncertain. And in that, Macron, a virtual outsider into politics, in the last 3-4 years, has actually made a niche for himself and has emerged as a voice of reason in Europe.
One particular reason why Macron and the French are particularly fond of Mr. Modi, because till he became Prime Minister, we had a pretty strong position on climate change.
Right.
The dramatic change was when Mr. Modi said, climate change is not bad just to the West, it's bad for us.
Absolutely.
And the deal in Paris to get the global climate change agreement, India played a key role. And solar energy and the stopping of global pollution is something which is very near and dear to Macron. And India really is one of the few developing countries adding to that process.
And also, Ramesh, if I can bring you in on this, one of the biggest and the most talked about defense deal, of course, is that of Rafale, which has hit a bit of a problem in terms of the pricing, which the Indian government says, look, we can't give you the exact pricing because of the secrecy deals that we've got with France. Now, there is talk that that particular deal could be updated. Any information as to what is likely to happen on that front?
By a high-level business delegation comprising CEOs from defense companies, including so talks on defense and defense cooperation can be expected to form a big component of their discussions here in New Delhi. On the bilateral side, also on the business side, where the companies will be having a CEOs forum later today. But that said, on the Rafale aircraft deal itself, Mohammed, we've seen this MMRCA deal, the tender, take forever to materialize. And Prime Minister Modi, after it came to power in 2014, travelled to France in 2015 and signed a government-to-government agreement for the purchase of 36 Rafale fighter aircraft in flyaway condition in the first installment, and proceeding on the assumption that we'll have manufacturing of the Rafale jets here in India under the transfer of technology partnership with France. So that, to my mind, we crossed a Rubicon of so to speak, because defense purchases were always in mired controversy. Prime Minister Modi taking the mantle upon himself to resolve this outstanding issue and carry the relationship forward, that, to my mind, is significant, and it keeps India in good stead going forward.
Absolutely, indeed. We'll discuss that in just a bit. And also, sir, if I can come to you on this, in terms of what is happening in the Indian Ocean region, we talk about this China's string of pearls strategy against India. And it is in this context that France, because of the 3 bases, like you mentioned, that it has in West Indian Ocean, how significant is this cooperation?
Look, as far as we are concerned, towards the east, we can pretty well manage, because we have the Andaman and Nicobar flight, and really, if one can really even block them at the Strait of Malacca. Towards the west is the oil-bearing regions, and you need to tie up. With the Americans, we have an agreement with the Pacific Fleet, but not with the 5th Fleet in Bahrain, which looks after this region. That's strange, and it should be corrected. In the meantime, the only power which can fill in and join us in keeping security going, and in fact helping us should there be problems with our Indians in the Gulf, is France with its base in Abu Dhabi.